What has this whole thing been about? I think it's about self-empowerment of the individual and the transition from being a subject to being a citizen. The Western media applies the term citizen to those who are challenging the regimes, but actually they are fighting to be citizens. Citizens is not what they are right now. Citizenship as an identity in the Middle East has been obstructed by religion, clan, tribe, and the whole kind of Arab nationalist business.
No doubt, I think most of what people say about the Arab Spring is correct. How the very high world food prices have played a role. Because it's very difficult to imagine in any society how you have, for instance, Jabhat al-Islami, the Islamic Front in Jordan, suddenly in bed with some of the leftist parties. It can only be a sort of a prevailing undercurrent of dissatisfaction driven by, prices that are 26% higher this time than they were last time, last year. So long as this is the case, the instability will reign, no matter who you have in government.
When elections occur, as I suspect they will in some form in Tunisia, and as they certainly will in Egypt, I expect the results to be similar, not identical, to the results in every election in an Arabic-speaking country that has taken place since 1990. And that is that in each case, Islamists have outperformed expectations. They advocate a constitutional provision that says no law shall violate the principles of Islam, and then they leave that to a court to adjudicate. And in fact, the courts almost never intervene to say that any law violates the principles of Islam, although it does happen every so often.
In many ways, we might expect Iran to have been a country that would have been vulnerable to the same kinds of pressures as in the Arab world, and certainly Iran has a strong tradition of mass public protest. So why didn't it happen in Iran? The first and most obvious explanation is that Iran is not an Arab country, and insofar as the succession of movements that we've seen in the Arab world are interconnected, we should not assume that interconnectedness would extend beyond the Arab world. Iran is a country that depends very heavily on oil, and oil prices have been high, and the state has been using its oil revenues to try to keep its population happy. Thirdly, in 2009, there was a highly contested presidential election from which Mr. Ahmadinejad emerged undoubtedly as president, but in the eyes of very many Iranians, he didn't emerge as president through having won the most votes. And that was followed by a massive nationwide set of protests, which, if they did not threaten the regime existentially, certainly presented the biggest domestic challenge to it in 30 years. Finally, and perhaps most controversially, I would argue that the Iranian political system, although it's authoritarian, although it has an ideology which is not supported by very large parts of the population, although it's run by aging men who are out of touch in many cases with the aspirations of ordinary Iranians, it is a political system which is much more vital and more dynamic, and indeed considerably younger than the sclerotic authoritarian presidencies that so far have been the main victims of the Arab Spring, or whatever we want to call the Arab Awakening.
How do these political parties have an economic program that speaks to the demographic challenges identified in the Arab Development Report, which crystallize in a moment where a person sets fire to himself because the shame and humiliation is too great? This genie is out of the bottle. A revolution against shame and humiliation against petty corruption, a revolution against shame and humiliation for the denial of any kind of economic future that allows you to be a man and a master in your house, and the shame and humiliation of not being a subject, not a citizen.